All right, today we're tackling a big one of the most world-shaking events of the last century, the Russian Revolution. We're going to look at how a massive, centuries-old empire didn't just fall, it completely vanished. And in its place rose a whole new kind of world order that would shape everything for the next 70 years.
So, let's just start with the central question, the one that kind of blows your mind when you think about it. How on earth does a dynasty, the Romanovs, who'd been in power for 300 years, just evaporate in 8 days? It sounds totally impossible, but it's exactly what went down.
And the change was just absolute. I mean, look at this. On one side, you have Tsarist Russia. Think of a gigantic, sprawling empire, kind of stuck in the past, run by one all-powerful czar. On the other side, the Soviet Union, the world's very first socialist state, run by a single, disciplined party. It's a night-and-day transformation, and we're about to see how it happened.
Okay, so to understand an explosion, you first got to understand the pressure cooker. We're going to start by looking at all the problems that were simmering for decades right under the surface of the Russian Empire.
Now, this right here, this visualizes the biggest problem of all. Just look at that number. A whopping 80% of the entire population were peasants. These were people living in deep poverty, desperate for their own land. You can't build a stable empire on a foundation like that. It was just waiting to crack.
So the key takeaway is that this wasn't about just one thing. It was a perfect storm. You had a czar, Nicholas II, who refused to change. You had that massive peasant problem we just saw. Then, in the cities, you had factory workers living in awful conditions. And all of this was the perfect soil for radical new ideas, like Marxism, to really take hold.
Right, so you've got all this pressure building up, but it needs a spark, something to light the fuse. That's what we're looking at next, the events that turned all that long-term anger into a full-blown crisis. The first major crack came in 1905. A crowd of peaceful protesters, literally marching to the Tsar's palace to ask for help, were shot down by soldiers. This was Bloody Sunday, and it was a huge psychological blow. The old idea that the Tsar was this godlike protector, the little father of his people, that idea died right there on the streets. But if Bloody Sunday was a crack, World War I was the sledgehammer that brought the whole building down. For Russia, the war was an absolute catastrophe. We're talking millions dead, food running out back home, and the government just completely falling apart. The state was literally crumbling under the strain of the war. And that brings us to 1917. The pressure cooker finally explodes. This is the first of two revolutions, the one that swept away the monarchy in what felt like the blink of an eye. You know how it all started? With women textile workers going on strike because there wasn't enough bread. It just snowballed from there. More workers joined in. And then, and this was the critical moment, the soldiers who were sent to stop the protests switched sides and joined them. Suddenly, the Tsar had no one left to enforce his rule. His power just evaporated. He had to give up the throne. But the Tsar leaving didn't magically solve the country's problems. Nope, it just created this huge power vacuum. Historians call this period dual power because you basically had two different governments trying to run the country at the same time. As you can imagine, that's not a recipe for stability. And this slide just lays out the conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got the official provisional government. Think of them as the moderates, and their biggest mistake was trying to keep Russia in the war. Then, on the other side, you had the Petrograd Soviet, a super powerful council of workers and soldiers. And they wanted the exact opposite: get out of the war, give land to the peasants, and change everything. These two were on a collision course. So, into this complete and utter chaos steps one of the most focused, determined revolutionaries in history, Vladimir Lenin. This next part is all about how his small, radical party, the Bolsheviks, saw their chance and just took control. So how'd they do it? With a message that was brutally simple and incredibly powerful. Peace, land, and bread. That's it. It was a promise that spoke directly to what millions of Russians desperately wanted. Peace to end the war, land for the peasants to farm, and bread to feed their families. When Lenin finally got back to Russia in April of 1917, he laid out this exact program. No compromise. He demanded an immediate stop to the war, all land to be given to the peasants, and his most famous rallying cry, all power to the Soviets, which was a direct challenge, basically a declaration of war, against the provisional government. By October, the country was a wreck, and the provisional government was powerless.
the Bolsheviks made their move. Led by Lenin and the military mastermind Leon Trotsky, their forces just systematically took over the key buildings in the capital, ending with the famous storming of the Winter Palace. It was fast, it was decisive, and honestly, pretty bloodless. But grabbing power is one thing. Holding on to it, especially in a country the size of Russia, that's a whole other ballgame. The next few years were an absolutely brutal fight to build a new state out of the rubber. Russia immediately plunged into a horrifying civil war. You had the Bolshevik Reds fighting for their new socialist dream against the Whites, which was basically everyone else. And here's the key reason the Reds won. The Whites were a mess, a jumble of different groups who all wanted different things. The Reds, on the other hand, had a single goal, a unified army, and they were absolutely ruthless. That focus made all the difference. Now, during the war, the Bolsheviks put in this policy called war communism. Basically, the state took control of everything, especially food from the peasants. It helped them win the war, but it totally wrecked the economy. So, facing massive rebellions, Lenin did a smart thing. He took a tactical step back. He introduced the new economic policy, the NEP, which allowed for a little bit of capitalism just to get the country running again. And with the Civil War finally won and the economy starting to breathe again, they made it official. In 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was formally created, a brand new kind of country that would become a global superpower for the rest of the century. Okay, so let's zoom out for the final part. Let's talk about the big takeaway, the massive, permanent impact this revolution had on the entire world. When you lay it all out like this, it's just a dizzying chain of events, isn't it? From the first cracks in 1905, to the Tsar being overthrown in February 17, then the Bolsheviks taking over just months later, plunging the country into a 3-year civil war, leading to the creation of the USSR in 22. And this first chapter really ending with Lenin's death in 1924. And why does any of this matter to the rest of us? Because this wasn't just a Russian story. It wiped a major European monarchy off the map. It created the first ever state based on the ideas of Karl Marx. It inspired revolutionaries all over the planet. And it basically drew the battle lines for the Cold War, splitting the world in two for decades. At the end of the day, this is the most important thing to remember. The Russian Revolution wasn't just one thing. It was a genuine, massive uprising of millions of people from the bottom. But it was also a brilliant, ruthless power grab by a small, organized group from the top. It was that unique combination that didn't just topple a czar, it completely redefined the world we live in.